Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we consider issues of history, religion, and culture and why they matter. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name's Mike Pierce, and today is the first episode in our brand new series on 16th and 17th century religious radicals.
Yes, now these lie at the root of very many modern denominations, right? So, why are we calling this series Doctrines of Demons, or is it just our usual clickbait? And what the heck is with prophets of violence?
Well, of course, it is clickbait. But in fairness, Catholic and Protestant spokesmen saw all radicals as heretics, even if their successors wouldn't today. In some cases, they were heretics, but in other cases not, and we'll pick those apart as we go through the series. But on the other side, the most crazed of the radicals, the kind we're going to consider today, seriously did want some sort of violent revolution.
Okay, so if today's guys were unbalanced, why are we bothering to take them seriously? I mean, to the point of doing an episode about them.
Because just looking at the good guys will give completely the wrong impression of the bigger picture. The historiography, quick side note, historiography, history of histories, the history of the way people have talked about this, the historiography of this period has been bedeviled by two opposite errors. The first one is a result of the stuff we're going to be looking at today. Dreadful, dreadful things were done by wild, violent, and utterly heretical people. And that was used to damn all religious radicals for several centuries. And so the way of talking about them by future generations assumed that all radicals, all Anabaptists, all religious dissent of any kind, really, was incipiently violent and dreadful. And so the record of them down to, I would say, really the beginning of the 20th century was like that. But by that time, most major Western countries, obviously Britain and America, but also a number of the others, had become, in fact, religiously tolerant, religiously pluralist. And the idea of voluntary religion seemed like such an obviously good idea that the radicals, or at least the sane ones among them, came in for much more favorable treatment. Right? But something else was happening around the same time. The Mennonites, named after Menno Simons, and basically all evangelical or biblicist Anabaptists took that name over a period of centuries. They had mostly gone to Canada and the United States and founded colleges which were actually really good. And of course, they were desperate to rehabilitate the reputation of Anabaptism. So you put those two things together, and what's happened during the 20th century is that the pendulum has swung to the opposite extreme, where they are talked about in roseate colors, I suppose. And what we're doing here is giving a balanced picture and showing how, and here comes our usual standard line, and this is why we do this whole vodcast, a foggy day on Olympus. The actual historical reality embarrasses all parties without exception. So we're looking at the bigger picture, right? And that's why we're looking at these pretty dismal types today.
Right. This comes in on a little bit of a personal note, right? Because you would actually identify yourself in some terms as agreeing mostly with Anabaptists, right? So
Right.
so even you're not immune to your own dissection.
No. But nobody is. But then nobody's personal life will bear complete scrutiny. And the same thing goes for our collective lives, right? Or whatever collectivity, whether it's an
Yes.
ethnicity or a nation or a political belief or a religious confession you want to line up with, none of them will emerge totally pristine from close
Right.
inspection. But that's what we're here to do, yeah?
Okay, so to get into it, we are taking our cue here from this verse in First Timothy, but it really only applies to some of these radicals, right? Including today's.
Yes, yes, especially today's. But of course, this kind of language, this kind of rhetoric was used by spokesmen for both the Catholic Church and for Protestants against all of the radicals right across the board. Now, you can blame them, and you should, for doing that, but it's a universal human tendency. We still see it today where somebody's attacking some political side or something like this. They usually lump all of them together with the obviously worst and say, well, actually, they're all like this, or that is representative. And that was what was going on then. Yeah.
So we're going to start off by talking about the Reformation a little bit, but we're kind of presupposing that our viewers already know at least the basics of the Reformation itself.
Yes, we are largely presupposing that, though we're going to have a little rescue mission here for about 2 or 3 minutes for those viewers for whom high school was quite a while ago. So, some things that we need to mention, yes. So, here's our man Martin Luther, and you've got his dates there. He had become an Augustinian monk, so a monk in the Augustinian order in 1505. He became professor of Bible at the University of Wittenberg from 1508. He was certainly academically brilliant, although, and some viewers will already know this, he was an extremely unusual character, let's put it like that. Very intense, quite emotional, showed signs later on of being an anti-intellectual. We still have some of those. Was a workaholic, prone to manic depression, spiritually very sensitive, but also capable of doing some pretty terrible things. So he was an interesting man and becomes initiator and leader of the Protestant Reformation from 1517 onwards. Now, it's worth asking, and I realised as I put this together that this is paraphrasing an essay title I set for generations of long suffering students who supported Luther in the years after 1517 and why. Right. So, who supported him in the earliest years and also who opposed him? Well, in the area of support, all of his colleagues at the University of Wittenberg lined up behind him to one degree or in one sense or another. We'll look at a sort of quasi exception in a moment. So there was a lot of group solidarity there. The university was pretty new and it had been established by Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. So he remained its patron and he gave tentative support, although didn't really commit himself to the cause until he was on his deathbed in 1525.
Right. Now, did Luther just get lucky in gaining this local prince's support, or do you think the prince felt like obligated to back up his university?
I think it was the second. He essentially held the dogs off for a vital few years at the start of the Reformation. What I mean by that is that there were strong forces that wanted to prosecute and may well have ended up executing Luther. And Frederick was absolutely blowed if he was going to allow this kind of attack on his university that he had founded. Now, what we've got to remember here is that Saxony was a bit of a cultural backwater, and he had been making a statement by founding this university that he is, in some sense, a Renaissance prince, right, up with the latest things in art and scholarship and all the rest of it. And he wasn't going to allow, if he could do anything about it, the authorities simply to go for Luther. And that gave him and his colleagues the space they needed to get the thing started and for the movement to spread. Yeah. Thirdly, many, but far from all, Renaissance scholars were at least sympathetic to the Protestants.
Right now, almost all Renaissance scholars were critical of the Catholic Church's failings. But that didn't automatically translate into support for Luther, though, right?
Right. Almost everybody was critical of the Catholic Church's failings. It's just that Renaissance scholars were able to do it, as it were, from a higher intellectual and moral plane. Even the papacy conceded that the church was corrupt. There was nobody arguing the opposite, right? But yeah, that didn't automatically translate into support, no. Most famously, of course, there was a clash between Erasmus, the greatest of the Renaissance scholars, and Luther. The Catholic authorities thought that Erasmus was a sympathizer, and in a way, especially in the first year or two, he was, but he had his hesitations, and that came out in a big clash. Sadly, not a topic we can pursue right now. Okay, and then finally on this, some of the German princes, we already mentioned Frederick, and the imperial cities.
Why should secular rulers back Luther?
Well, because where Luther ends up by 1520 is saying that the secular authorities should reform the church in their territories if it won't reform itself. And what that means is that secular princes can then take control of the church. Now, this is something that probably almost no one learned in high school, but they really, really should. And that is that through the Middle Ages in the West, the church is more powerful on balance than the state. So if you are a secular ruler, the church has more control over the lives of your people than you do. It is, to borrow an anachronistic term, international, and it has loads of wealth. If you could find a reason, especially a religious reason, for taking control of that, you would get A, more control over your population, and B, control over quite a lot of its property. And so that was appealing. It came with dangers. Some rulers didn't want to do this, but because, and I often get the sensation that even loads of modern scholars of the Reformation period keep forgetting, everybody had been brought up as a good Catholic. What if Luther's wrong? Maybe I'll go to hell. Right?
Right.
That. But also that maybe my population will resist. Well, the opinions of a single peasant or even a few peasants on its own means absolutely nothing. But all of them together, that means a lot. You do need consent of the governed in that rather brutal sense. Also, what happens if my neighbours then make war on me and claim to have Holy Mother Church on their side? This is the end of my life.
Mhm.
So it came with
Yeah.
dangers, but there was also the appeal.
Right.
Well, who was opposed? Almost everyone else in the West, basically, especially the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And just a quick reminder here, the Holy Roman Empire is a kind of greater Germany. It included all that we now consider Germany, plus the Czech lands, Austria, the Netherlands and Belgium in today's terms, bits of northern Italy, and a few other bits and pieces. So that, and it was a large amalgam of principalities, imperial cities, city-states, prince-bishoprics, and so on. So the ruler above all of these rulers, he certainly did not want this. But the bulk of the population weren't really interested in this, even if they had criticisms of the corruptions of the church. Okay, well, the trouble with starting a reformation is that it'll carry on and get out of hand. The Catholic critics of Luther were quite right that if you do this, then you're going to start a process of endless religious fragmentation. If you say, well, it's the Bible that should be the authority and not the institutional church, this is presupposing that everybody's going to agree on how the Bible should be interpreted, a suggestion which today seems laughable to anybody who knows anything at all about this, right? But at the time, it was perhaps not quite so obvious. But what then about people who wanted to say, well, maybe the Holy Spirit should be a controlling influence in how you read the Bible? just to take an example here. Well, this man, Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt, was the awkward squad inside the faculty at the University of Wittenberg. He meant well, and in a sense, he was kind of a good man, but boy, was he irritating. And he certainly had some of these kind of critiques of Luther, although he was a senior colleague and he seemed to find it very hard to cope with the fact that his junior colleague, Martin Luther, had, during the course of late 1517 and 1518, become a sort of international superstar. And he, Karlstadt, had not. And he seemed to find this hard to forgive. We don't have time to go into the details of his dissent from Luther. On the one hand, he supported what Luther was saying against the Catholic authorities, but he also wanted to go much further. He wanted to empower ordinary people as he saw it. Yeah, he went around sometimes in peasant garb, not in this picture here, but on other occasions he did. This is like the beginnings of the movement that today flourishes as, grenade shredded jeans on bourgeois teenagers. It's that kind of a tilt, right? He was horrified by the actual people with whom he found himself allying by the mid-1520s, but we can't really follow that story here. What we can do, however, is return to our main business, which is obviously selling books. Now, like so many topics, there's a vast literature here, and this one is by far the best, but I can't imagine many of our viewers wanting to buy it because it is a total cinder block of a book at 1,500 pages. I used to joke to students that nobody has read the whole of the Radical Reformation, possibly not even G.H. Williams. It should probably be used as a reference work rather than a read-through. And to that purpose, I use it very frequently. Right? Just a couple of weeks ago, I was acting as external examiner for somebody's MTH on a religious radicals topic. And this person mentioned someone whose name tinkled the faintest bell in my mind, but I couldn't remember who they were. So what did I do? I reached across for my copy of G.H. Williams and looked him up and said, oh, okay, yeah, right, you, gotcha. So, but he's very useful. He is not at all polemical, but he does overwhelm you with mountains and mountains of facts. But for anybody who's into things to do with religious radicals in this period, this is unsurpassed, I think. So he looks at radicals of all kinds, biblicist and evangelical, whom we will look at next week. Spiritualist, that's a category that has nothing at all in common with modern people who, can't keep their tables on the floor. It means people who insisted upon a spiritualizing hermeneutic of Scripture. A lot of these people were actually extremely attractive. Some of them took things rather too far. Rationalists, particularly those who ended up being anti-Trinitarian, and then finally the kind of people we're going to be looking at today, the violent and revolutionary types.
If nothing else, if you're vertically challenged, you could probably use this book as a nice step stool.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. It becomes so tempting to name particular individuals at this point who could use this just as a way of abusing them, but I will restrain myself. It's now blood spurting from my lower lip. Anyway, perhaps also is an opportunity here to mention The Great Restoration by some fool called Mike Pierce. It's everything most despised about academic books. It's clear and concise. It is aimed at students. It is flippant, and best of all, it is out of print, but it's still available secondhand. So depending on how battered you like your secondhand copy, you can get it as cheap as about $10, or you can pay about $50 or $60 for it. So there you go.
You're really selling this one.
Yeah, I am actually. Yeah. I think my favourite compliment was from an undergraduate who bought it and told me that the thing she liked best about it was, as she read it, she could hear my sneaky little voice talking in her head. She went,
You know, the one time that I did pick it up, I actually had that experience.
"Oh,
I know
there
what
you
she's
are."
talking
See, so
about.
hallucinating wildly, right?
Yeah. You know, that will actually keep some people from buying this book, probably.
Thank you for that. I think what I ought to do, if you're going to keep insulting me like this, is I need to come over there and shock you, and that'll serve you right.
Well, wouldn't that be horrible?
Probably. It's almost too bad to think about. Yes.
Okay, so maybe we should ask, why really did you write this book? Clearly, it was not for the money.
Clearly, it was not for the money. I once calculated how much I was making per hour by acknowledging the amount that I got from the publisher and then dividing that by the approximate number of hours it took me to write them, and realized that I would be better off cleaning toilets in Bosnia. Anyway, so not for the money. It was aimed at students presupposing nothing more than a general knowledge of the Reformation. But also, I was trying to correct the second of the two big errors that we talked about a few minutes ago, because by the time this book was written, we were well into that, where books were coming out that were just idealizing the Anabaptists. Right? And what I wanted to do was to show the wider picture, and how even the good guys, whom I really admire too, had demonstrable connections by letter and personal connections and so on with some of the terrible people we're going to be talking about right now. And although we might want to disentangle them or hermetically seal them off from one another, it can't really be done. So, yeah, that's what the book was for.
Right, and maybe you can explain the restoration bit in the title.
Well, yeah, this is one thing that almost all of the radicals, the good, the bad, and the ugly, really did have in common. They all emphasized that they wanted to restore the early church. The reformers, the Protestant reformers, wanted to reform Christendom. Right? They agreed with the Catholic Church that there should be a compulsory church embracing everybody by force, imposing itself by persecution, but their own right one, as opposed to the Catholics' wrong one. What the radicals wanted to do, by their own very, very different lights, was to restore early Christianity. And they all pointed to that passage in early Acts where Peter is preaching about Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the time comes for the restoration of all things predicted by the prophets. That. Right? They all picked up on that idea. So, as opposed to the program of Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and so on, which was the Great Reformation, this is the Great Restoration.
Right.
Okay, well, let's look at the first of our really significant characters today, and this is this man, Thomas Müntzer, who was one of the important leaders in the German Peasants' War, which we'll explain in a moment.
Now, Müntzer was a lot more sinister than Karlstadt, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was calling for the godless, as defined by himself, of course, to be killed. He saw himself, as we shall see in a moment, as a kind of new Daniel. He wanted a social revolution. He claimed that the clergy, whether Catholic or Protestant, were all wicked, and amongst those earmarked for destruction. So whereas Karlstadt is merely kind of bumbling and idealistic, Münster is actually egging violence on. Yeah. So here we have his portrait. You can see he's born in 1488. He dies, he's executed actually in 1525. And in tolerably recent times, he was actually celebrated by the so-called German Democratic Republic, i.e., totalitarian communist East Germany, as a proponent of what they call the Volksreformation, the People's Reformation, as opposed to Luther's bourgeois variety. So implicitly indicating that he's a sort of proto-communist, which wasn't really quite true. I mean, the categories didn't properly apply. So he's actually commemorated on a 5-mark note during the 45 years or so of the dead era. Okay, well, we have a whole volume of writings by Müntzer, and I'm being a good boy not brandishing them at our viewers today. But this is just an excerpt from his sermon before the princes. Now, Münster lived not a million miles away from Wittenberg at a place called Allstedt. And from his extremely turbulent preaching, of course, he disturbed the authorities and was called to account to come and defend himself. Now, this kind of incident happened a lot during the 1520s and 1530s. And always it was a prelude to condemning the person who was invited to come and explain his ideas. It was laying the groundwork for it so that he couldn't claim that he'd been condemned unheard. And such people, including Müntzer here, always took the invitation up, knowing what the outcome would be, but knowing that this was their main chance to put their ideas across in a public forum. And so he does it. So this is an excerpt from it. The man who has not received the living witness of God knows really nothing about God, though he may have swallowed 100,000 Bibles.
That's a cute thing to say, but really, this is a big issue that's thrown up by the Reformation, right? I mean, if the authority of the Bible trumps the authority of the Pope and tradition, who gets to interpret the Bible? I mean, we're simply trading the authority of men in fancy gowns for that of learned scholars. Don't we need the living witness to interpret it?
Yeah, these are all burning questions that are still with us today. You look at some of the debates, sometimes politely conducted, sometimes not, between more middle class denominations with their emphasis upon scholarship and the hurly-burly preachiness of some other denominations, right? And that argument, in a sense, is still going on. How you answer them will go a long way in deciding which denomination you belong to. Okay, God comes in dreams to his beloved, as he did to the patriarchs, prophets, and apostles. He comes especially in affliction. That's why Brother Easy Chair rejects him.
Brother Easy Chair has to be Luther, I'm assuming.
It certainly is, yes. And remember, he's preaching here to the princes, so he's taking a side swipe at Luther in their presence. God pours out his Spirit upon all flesh, and now the Spirit reveals to the elect a mighty and irresistible reformation to come. This is the fulfillment of the prediction of Daniel about the fifth monarchy. Now, quick side note here. It's not just the guys we're looking at today. All of the radicals, almost all of the radicals, strongly emphasized eschatology. The Catholic Church downplayed it. The Protestant Reformers definitely downplayed it. Luther didn't even really think that the book of Revelation should be in the Bible. But the radicals played it sometimes too hard, as Münster is doing here. King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to kill the wise men because they could not interpret the dream for him. This was a deserved reward, for they wished to rule his whole kingdom with their cleverness, and yet could not even do that for which they had been installed. Such is also the case of our clerics now. Implication, you should kill our clerics now. That's effectively what he's saying here. Okay, you princes of Saxony, you need a new Daniel to disclose unto you this revelation and to show you your role.
You'd almost think that he has someone in mind here.
Yes, you would, really. Christ our Lord says, whosoever shall offend one of these little ones, it's better for him that a millstone be hung about his neck and that he be thrown into the depth of the sea. You can gloss over here and there as much as you like. These are the words of Christ. Now, if Christ can say, whosoever offends one of the little ones, what should one say then if one offends a great multitude in their faith? That is what the archvillains do, who vex the whole world and make it forsake the true Christian faith.
Okay, so a lot of popular criticisms of the church had come out as anti-clericalism. The priests are lousy. So Müntzer is taking that and weaponizing that against all clergy, Protestant and Catholic
Yeah, that
alike.
is exactly what he is doing here. The authority of all of them is to be set aside in favor of a prophet, a new Daniel. Bible trumps institution, but spirit trumps Bible. And as I say, those kinds of discussions are still with us, even if, fortunately, we don't have so many people wanting to kill others in the name of it at the moment. Okay, now, if you want to be true governors, you must, as Christ commanded, drive his enemies from the elect. Think not that the power of God will be realized if you let your swords rust in the scabbard. Christ said that he came not to bring peace, but a sword. And Deuteronomy says, you are a holy people. Spare not the idolaters, break down their altars, smash their images, and burn them in the fire. The sword is given to you to wipe out the ungodly. If you decline, it will be taken from you. Those who resist should be slaughtered without mercy, as Elijah smote the priests of Baal. Priests and monks who mock the gospel as expounded by him, should be killed. The godless have no right to live. May you, like Nebuchadnezzar, appoint a Daniel to inform you of the leadings of the Spirit.
Wow. Okay, so we've got misinterpreted words of Christ being conflated with the Old Testament. I mean, you can really see why he's an anti-intellectual.
Yeah, none of this would have survived more than a few minutes proper exegesis. But that would need to happen, right? But because he's setting all of that aside, you can take a verse from over here and a passage from over there and put them together in whatever fashion you choose. You know, as I like to say, the atheists are right about one thing: you can prove anything you want from the Bible. And it's true, you can. And that is exactly what's going on there. But that's why, even if you decide that you don't want a church run by intellectuals, you can't do without them. And at the risk of sounding preachy here, I would say, you know, the earliest church functioned with a Peter and a Paul. And yes, they argued, but they both needed to be there, right? One a giant intellectual, the other one a fisherman from Galilee. And we
Right.
do need them both. Sorry, that's their end of the sermon. We'll move swiftly on. So Münster ends up being one of the principal leaders of the Peasants' War that convulsed central Germany and southern Germany during the later part of 1524 and the spring of 1525.
And he didn't actually survive the fighting that he led, did he?
No, he didn't. Yet he was captured after the Battle of Frankenhausen in May 1525. Not that it was much of a battle. A few hundred soldiers completely massacred thousands of peasants armed with little more than sharpened farming tools and who had never had any military training at all, just within an hour or so. And he was captured, tortured, gave a partial recantation, and then executed. Now, we don't have time to look at this at all, but the end of the 15th century and the early 16th century saw a number of peasant risings in Europe, particularly in the German speaking lands, for social and economic reasons that we can't look at here. All peasant risings fail because they don't have an alternative program to put in its place, and mostly they don't have significant leadership by the very nature of the case. And Münzer was the best that they'd got. So he saddles up to
Right.
this one. I mean, the Peasants' War of 1524 to 5 is the daddy of them all, of these particular kinds of risings, and that failed ignominiously as well. Yeah.
Now, we're about to make a chronological jump here of, well, not very long, but a few years during which a lot happened. Why exactly are we doing that?
Because I think we we need to see that there's at least some continuity in this violent tradition. There were people who survived the death of Münster, the defeat of the peasants in 1525, and still thought in this kind of direction, but no really major influential figures until we get to this very interesting character, much more interesting, I think, than Münzer, and that is Melchior Hoffmann, who, whilst it would be unfair to blame him for the ultimate disaster of this kind of violent radicalism at the city of Münster. Right, Münzer is a man, Münster the city. Completely different. Don't confuse. Right. While it would be unfair to blame Hoffmann entirely for that, he certainly sets events moving in a direction that will end up there, even though he deplored the end of the story that we're about to go into now. Well, who is this guy? He's born around 1495, dies in prison in 1543. He was a furrier from southwest Germany. He became a supposedly Lutheran preacher traveling around the Baltic, picking up eclectic, very un-Lutheran doctrines as he went along.
Okay, what do we mean by supposedly Lutheran?
Well, he claimed at the outset to be Lutheran, and at one point, as we'll see in a moment, he does get endorsement from Luther, but loads of people wanted this kind of endorsement, and he gave it, perhaps without having full information about the guy, and then later regretted that, because Hoffmann is moving further and further away from the kinds of things that Luther thought. So, like most of the radicals, even like Karlstadt, certainly like Münzer, he wanted to smash up images and religious art of all kinds and statues. Luther did not want that. He stressed eschatology, which Luther certainly didn't like. He preached an element of social revolutionism and anti-intellectualism. Like all of the radicals, he disagreed with Luther over sacraments. So Luther held a doctrine which we call consubstantiation. That is, that although Luther disagreed with the Catholic view of transubstantiation, that the bread and the wine become entirely the body and blood of Christ at communion, he nevertheless thought that at communion the bread was simultaneously bread and physically the body of Christ. The wine was simultaneously wine and the blood of Christ. Whereas the radicals said, no, it's simply a memorial. Right? And Hoffmann went over to that view too. But he also later on becomes an Anabaptist. At this point, I think we need to look at a map of his doings, because there's a fair bit to say about this man, Hoffmann. So he starts in southwest Germany. He spends a lot of his career up in the Baltics, in Volmar, you can see there in 1523, and Dorpat. And he's causing chaos wherever he goes. He's preaching Reformation, but he's encouraging people to smash up churches and images and denouncing the priests and so on. And so it's causing civil disturbance. He keeps on being chucked out of one place after another. You can see there from our map that he goes to pay a quick visit to Wittenberg in 1524 and again in 1527 to get the imprimatur of Luther, and then goes back to the Baltics. He goes to Stockholm in 1526. Now, Stockholm, like so many of these cities around the Baltics, had a German majority run by German traders, largely these cities. And in the case of Stockholm, they had recently lost control of the city. It had passed over to Swedes. So there were a number of people there receptive to his ideas because they'd recently been politically disempowered. And radical ideals will appeal to such people. But he gets kicked out of there. He goes to Denmark and he's indulged for a little while, but eventually he gets kicked out again. I hope you're following the trajectory around the map here. And then he goes very significantly to the Netherlands and falls in with a bunch of people that we call sacramentarians. Now, the sacramentarians in the Netherlands were not exactly Protestant, but they were tilting that way. They were people who disbelieved in transubstantiation, and they held a view of communion that it was simply memorial of the death of Christ. And to support this view were falling back increasingly on the authority of the Bible to uphold what they were saying. And Hoffmann was impressed with them. They were very impressed with him. And he spent some time there. He then moves to Strasbourg, which you can see on the map there towards the lower part on the left. Now, Strasbourg was in a very interesting situation during the late 1520s, early 1530s. It was politically unstable, and it had effectively religious toleration. Not because anybody wanted it, but because neither the Catholic Party nor the Protestant Party was firmly in control. And so all kinds of radical and Anabaptist groups sprang up there because they wouldn't be persecuted. Both good, bad, and ugly radical groups. Right? Some of them native to the town, some of them other people fleeing there to avoid persecution. Hoffmann fell in with a group that was dominated by people who believed in prophecy. And they were very impressed with Melchior. They said that he was one of the two prophets of the end times. He was the return of Elijah predicted in the book of Revelation. And while there, he is converted to Anabaptism in the sense of a belief in believers' baptism and is baptized there. Fortified with this belief, he goes back to the Netherlands and on his second visit hits the region like a rocket. He is saying to people who already believe that communion is simply a commemoration of the death of Christ, well, also you should believe in believers' baptism, because baptism doesn't make a baby clean from original sin. Right? It's something done by the believers themselves out of obedience to Christ. And thousands of sacramentarians are converted to Anabaptism, but to his extremely unstable form of it, shot through with social revolutionism and apocalyptics. And then Melchior gets a prophecy. He must go back to Strasbourg, which will be the new Jerusalem, and he will be imprisoned when he's there. But then the Messiah will return, and the saints will be vindicated. And he goes back. And the first part of his prophecy comes true. He is clapped in irons, but he's kept there for the rest of his life. So now we have a dodgy, unstable Anabaptist movement in the Netherlands that has no leader. Enter the really, really seriously bad guys. And that brings us to Jan Matthys. Now, what we're going to look at now is a couple of pages by a wonderful man called Obbe Philips, who was part of this Dutch sacramentarian become Dutch Anabaptist movement. But he is strongly evangelical and horrified at what is about to take place. And he writes his so-called confession many years later in 1560, recording what happens. Okay, so here we go. Now, dear friends, before the half year of Melchior's prophesied imprisonment came to an end, his actual imprisonment will be 10 years, there arose a baker of Haarlem named Jan Matthys, who had an elderly wife whom he deserted, and he took with him a brewer's daughter, who was a very pretty young slip of a girl and had great knowledge of the gospel. He enticed her away from her parents with sacred and beautiful words and told how God had shown great things to him and she would be his wife. He carried her secretly with him to Amsterdam and brought her to a clandestine place.
I'm always amazed at how such obvious frauds find people to believe in them.
Yes, yes. Although actually it's much more amazing now than it would be concerning the 16th century. Anybody, even uneducated, perhaps even not very intelligent people, can know about religious frauds if they care just to turn on the TV. Right? We have so much experience of them. This kind of thing is happening all of the time. But what we need to remember is that this was not completely non-existent, but much less common then. Everybody had been constrained within the Catholic Church. Yes, there was all kinds of shenanigans going on within that, but it was at least institutionally constrained, right? You didn't get bakers from Harlem jumping up and doing all this kind of stuff. So these people had no experience. So when someone presents themselves as divinely inspired or having divine authority or what have you, some people are going to be more easily taken in, and they're not necessarily completely stupid.
Right.
Now, when he came there, he professed to have been greatly driven by the Spirit and told how God had revealed great things to him, which he could tell to no one, that he was the other witness, Enoch. Now, when the friends or brethren heard of this, they became apprehensive and knew not what they should do. For Melchior, whom they regarded as the second Elijah, had written that they should follow Zerubbabel and Haggai in building the temple. They should refrain from baptizing for 2 years. Melchior had made a parallel between their situation and the return of the Jews to the Holy Land after captivity in Babylon. And because they were being persecuted, the radical Anabaptists, they should actually put a stop to rebaptizing just to stop the persecution for a little while, because God would soon vindicate them anyway. That was the lesson that he drew. They'd also heard that Cornelius Polterman was Enoch, another one of their members. Now, when Jan Matthys learned of this, he carried on with much emotion and terrifying alarm, and with great and desperate curses, cast all into hell and to the devils to eternity, who would not hear his voice and who would not recognize and accept him as the true Enoch. Because of this, some went into a room without food and drink, in fasting and prayer, and were almost all as disconsolate over such threats as if they lay in hell. For we were at that time all unsuspecting, and no one knew that such false prophets could arise in the midst of the brethren.
Now, there are points of contact here with how religious charlatans get away with stuff today.
Yes, and Matthys is, as it were, playing the playbook, even though he probably didn't know the playbook. He's instinctively making it up as he goes along, to perfection. Coming to this passage always reminds me of a wonderful little devotional book, mostly devotional book, that I read decades ago by a Christian psychologist called John White. And the book is called The Golden Cow. It's probably out of print, but if you can find it online, it's a good investment of your money. Very sound advice. And there's an absolutely purple passage in there where White says to us, now, if you become a preacher and want to get results, as it were, and get people to do whatever you're saying, this is what you're to do. And of course, he doesn't mean that you should do that at all. He's telling you this so that you are immune when it is done to you. And he gives several really brilliant pieces of advice there. He says, you need to shout and then suddenly lower your voice and then go back to shouting again. Keep changing the decibel level in the room. Make sure that the room is packed. If there isn't a big enough crowd, then find a smaller room, because we're more suggestible then. Hold your meeting in the evening, not the morning, because we're more suggestible then. Keep changing the emotional tone of the room. So make like you're angry, talk about the judgment of God, talk about wicked sins, and then tell a weepy story. and then suddenly tell a joke, and he says you will find that everyone laughs, and it has nothing at all to do with your skill as a comedian. They are laughing from relief. And you keep doing this, changing the decibel level and the emotional level. And he says people's underarm deodorants will stop working, and after half an hour or so of this, they will do whatever it is that you indicate. And of course, he is right.
Right.
And so at some level, that's what's going on here, and we'll see that particularly in view of what he does next.
Right. Maybe we should have put a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode. Some people are probably feeling a little uncomfortable.
I do think that almost all of our viewers will recognize at least some elements, maybe even all of the elements of that in some meetings, some preachers that they have seen. And okay, here comes some pastoral advice from me. Shun such preachers. Right? This behavior is as the sin of witchcraft. The gospel needs to be presented open-handedly, deceiving nobody in everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so look at what Matisse does next. So a few minutes later, there came a youth of around 12 years of age, innocence, right, proclaiming peace, and hands were proffered and clasped in greeting. So we've changed the emotional temperature entirely. Then they again came to themselves, and the fearful anxiety subsided among them. And therewith, and after much negotiation, they attached themselves to Jan Matisse and became obedient.
Wow.
Okay. What happens next is that Matisse and his rather large following seize control of the city of Münster. Now, Münster is today just inside Germany, but near the Dutch border. The territory is all of a continuum. And if Strasbourg had been politically unstable, Münster even more so. And these violent Anabaptists managed to take control of the city and either forcibly expel both the Catholic and the Protestant factions or force them to submit. And they established that total contradiction in terms, an Anabaptist state. The whole point of Anabaptism is a belief in believers' baptism, voluntary religion, right? So this is a complete contradiction in terms here. Now, the description we've got here of what happens, I'm taking from a book written in the 1950s that is still in print by Norman Cohn, and it's called The Pursuit of the Millennium. And it's a collection of mostly pretty horrible stories about apocalyptic religious groups from the late Middle Ages through to the 16th century. His descriptions are all hostile, but in most cases, and certainly in this one, deservedly so. So we're not going to complain about that. So he talks about the millennial kingdom of Münster once Matisse and his henchmen have taken charge there. A blacksmith spoke out against Matisse. The Profeta at once had him arrested and taken to the marketplace. The whole population was also summoned there, and Matisse, surrounded by a bodyguard, made a speech in which he declared that the Lord was outraged at the slandering of his prophet and would take vengeance on the whole community unless this godless smith was cut off from the body of the chosen people. The few eminent citizens who protested against the illegality of the proceedings were themselves thrown into prison, and Matisse first stabbed and then shot the smith. The crowd was warned to profit by this example and dutifully sang a hymn before it dispersed.
Wow, this is kind of giving Jonestown vibes.
Right. Yes. Now, Jonestown was a dreadful incident in which hundreds of people died in Guyana. These were people who belonged to basically an American cult. And because they were being given a hard time by the law authorities in America, moved to Guyana, and eventually he got everyone to take poison on his account. But the more general point is that these kinds of leaders make their own authority central to everything that's happening, everything that is said. So it's totally conflated with the authority of God. So this is really where the kind of thing that Müntzer had been saying, you need a new Daniel, where that finally leads, that whole way of talking.
Yeah.
Supported by and constantly appealing to the semi-literate, the social revolution in Münster was uncompromisingly anti-intellectual. The Anabaptists boasted of their innocence of book learning and declared that it was the unlearned who had been chosen by God to redeem the world. When they sacked the cathedral, they took particular delight in defiling, tearing up, and burning the books and manuscripts of its old library. Finally, in the middle of March 1534, Matisse banned all books save the Bible. All other works, even those in private ownership, had to be brought to the cathedral square and thrown upon a great bonfire. This act symbolized a complete break with the past, a total rejection, above all, of the intellectual legacy of earlier generations. In particular, it deprived the inhabitants of Münster of all access to theological speculations from the fathers onwards, and thereby assured the Anabaptist leaders of a monopoly in the interpretation of the scriptures.
Okay, so this is something that even today, I feel like cults try to make sure their adherents read and see nothing except the material that's produced by the cult. And then everything else is declared as contaminated.
Right. And this is the far end of the trajectory of preachers who may, for the time being at least, be within the bounds of orthodoxy, who continually emphasize the specialness of their group. Then you build up a rhetoric around that, and then everything else is at first slightly spiritually infra-dig, and then finally contaminated, and then more and more you have complete control over people. So this, of course, is at the far end of all of that. Yes. Well, I like to say, mostly just as a joke, that the ecumenical movement does not begin in 1910 with the Edinburgh Missionary Conference. It begins with Münster in the early 1530s, when Protestants and Catholics agree about at least this, in bringing together besieging armies around the city of Münster to put it down, which they do. But the radicals fight fairly well, actually. But in one sortie, led by Matisse himself, out into the enemy camp, he is literally cut to pieces. So the siege continues, but you now have, if possible, an even worse man in charge, and that's this fellow, Jan Boykels van Leyden. Leiden being the city in the northern Netherlands, of course. And he instituted polygamy, particularly for himself, communism, no private property, and capital punishment for all offences. So it is an absolute nightmare state. Besieged, so increasingly hungry, and clearly doom is written right across it. In October, the prophet Dusenschur suddenly announced that the trumpet of the Lord would sound thrice, and that at the third blast all the inhabitants of the town must foregather at Mount Zion, alias the Cathedral Square. The men were to come armed, but they were to bring their women and children too. Together the children of God would march out of the town. They would be endowed with supernatural strength, so that 5 of them could kill 100 of the enemy, and 10 could kill 1,000. I'll leave you to do the maths of that on your own. Anyway, the enemy would flee before them, so they would march victoriously to the promised land. Unspecified. The trumpets did indeed sound, but they were blown by Dusenschur himself. Failure to obey the prophet would have been suicidal, so when the third blast sounded, everyone, even women with newborn babies, came to the meeting place. But at the last moment, the expedition was suddenly cancelled. The king announced that he'd wished merely to test the loyalty of his people. Enthroned over this nightmare kingdom, Bokelson deployed with ever greater extravagance his old techniques of domination. He proclaimed that it had been revealed to him that the people would be saved by Easter 1535. If they were not, he should be burnt in the marketplace. When no deliverance came, he explained that he had spoken only of a spiritual salvation. And of course, what happens in the end is that finally the besiegers do break through. There's a general massacre of the population, men, women, and children alike. And they're the lucky ones because the surviving leaders are tortured to death in public and their bodies hung from cages from St. Lambert's Church. Here's St. Lambert's Church, and zooming in there, we can see the stage with torture being conducted. And here are those cages, which are still there.
Oof. So, this experience of Münster really damns Anabaptism and religious radicalism of all kinds for several centuries. But in fact, that's kind of unfair. I mean, most radicals were nothing like
Right,
this.
most of them were nothing like this. Even many of those who were, by ordinary lights, completely heretical, were not necessarily violent. Many were very orthodox and not violent at all, indeed pacifist. And it's those others, particularly the biblicist evangelicals, whose ideas are still with us, that we're going to be looking at next week.
Well, thank goodness for that.
Right. So next week, we're going to look at those Anabaptist radicals who broke the link between church and state, insisted that churches consist only of the personally converted, not whole populations, which is what both Catholics and Protestants had wanted, and accidentally, by doing that, blazed the trail for the modern world and many of the things that we now take for granted. So yes, please do rejoin us next week where our story is, well, in some ways a lot more cheerful. I mean, these people were persecuted ferociously, but they in themselves are at least an awful lot more wholesome to look at. And yeah, that's what we're going to be doing.
Yes, like you said, this was a bit of a grim episode in some places, but I personally am very excited about this series in particular. I really enjoy looking at some of these old guys and hanging out with some old guys too, I guess. But anyway, anyway, we would really appreciate it, both of us, if you enjoyed this episode, if you would repost it on social media, follow us on YouTube or on Facebook and some other places. You can find our episodes on Spotify as well, if that is more to your fancy. So yes, please repost on social media. We're trying to annoy the entire world with our...
This is the plan, yes. So yes, please do that. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.